drowning in the flood. Tahnee did not know the hand pulling her out would, by Apache law, make her his wife within the year. A sentence meant to cage her that would turn out to be the very thing that finally set her free to love him. Her name was Tahnee, and the man was Emmett Cole, and what the flood tried to take from her that day, their two proud, unwilling hearts would spend the whole coming year learning to give back as love. Watch till the end, because a woman who should have died in that river was about to become the reason the lonely rancher remembered how to live, like it or not. Territory of Arizona, the autumn of 1881, along a stretch of red country where the San Carlos Reservation ran up hard against cattle range, and a flash flood had just turned a 2-foot crossing into a drowning trap in under an hour. Wad travels strange in flood country. It doesn't need a rider or a wire. It needs only water, loud enough, and a handful of witnesses. And by the time Emmett Cole had Tahnee coughing up river on the mud of the bank, word of what had happened at Cottonwood Crossing was already moving through two worlds that rarely agreed on anything. He had not gone looking for a woman to save. He had gone looking for 6 strayed heifers that had wandered off his lease during the first hard rain, following their tracks along the wash until the wash itself turned to a churning brown river with no warning at all. Not thunder, not a cloud he'd trusted, just a wall of water coming down out of the Pinaleos faster than any man could outrun on foot. He heard the crossing before he saw it, a sound like the whole hillside grinding its teeth. And under that sound, thin and getting thinner, a voice. She had been driving 3 pack mules loaded with baskets and woven mats toward the agency trading post when the water rose beneath her without asking permission. 1 mule scrambled clear. The other 2, and Tahnee herself, did not. The cold took her legs first, then her breath, then the sense of up and down folding into each other until she no longer knew which way led to air. Then a hand. She would not learn, until much later, whose hand it was. Emmett went in without deciding to. That was the truth of it, though he would spend weeks afterward trying to dress the moment up as a calculation, a weighing of odds, a decent man's careful reasoning. There had been no calculation. There had only been a shape going under 15 feet from the bank, black hair fanned across brown water, his own boots already kicking free of the current before his mind caught up to his body. A fistful of her sleeve on the first pass, lost, her wrist on the second, and he did not let go again no matter what the river argued, and it argued hard, rolling them both twice before it finally, grudgingly, let the bank have her instead. He dragged her out, coughing, retching river water into the mud, her whole body shaking so hard he feared the cold alone might finish what the flood had started. His own soaked coat came off without a thought and went around her shoulders, the same instinct he'd use covering a fevered calf, and it was only when she lifted her head and looked at him, really looked, dark eyes sharp even through the shivering, that he understood he was not free to simply set her down and ride on. You're going to be all right, no notion whether that was true. A single hard nod was all she gave back, teeth chattering too hard for speech, one hand pressed flat over her own heart as if checking that it had, in fact, decided to keep beating. That might have been the whole of it. A rancher hauls a stranger from a flood, wraps her in his coat, walks her to shelter, rides on with a story for the next roundup. It might have ended there if the ridge above the crossing had stayed empty. It did not stay empty. By the time Emmett had her sitting upright against a boulder, breath coming back in ragged pulls, riders lined that ridge who had not been there an hour before, and they had not come by accident. A boy from the second mule train had run the whole way to the rancheria the moment the water took her, and word in flood country does not wait for wires. The band that came down off that ridge belonged to a Chiricahua family long settled near the agency, kin to Tahnee through her mother, and the man riding at their front was her mother's elder brother, known to the soldiers who dealt with him as Nantan Loco, and among his own people by his true name, and which he had spent 40 hard years earning rather than merely wearing. He did not hurry his horse down that slope. A man who had survived 4 decades of broken treaties learns early that hurry is a young man's error, and that stillness carries louder than any shout. Behind him rode a dozen more, men and a few of the older women, faces set in the particular stillness of people who had learned the hard way, that showing fear or fury too plainly to a white man's face rarely bought them anything but more grief. Tahnee recognized her cousin Nalin among the riders, a girl 2 winters younger than herself who had once raced her bareback down this same wash and lost. Nalin's eyes went wide at the sight of her soaked and shivering on the bank, and it was all the girl could do to hold her place in the line rather than break rank and run to her. He found his niece alive on the riverbank, wrapped in a stranger's coat. He found the stranger himself, standing a careful distance off, hands open at his sides, palms out, the plain language every frontierman and every Apache warrior both understood without a word passing between them. "I have not come to fight you." Bidzil dismounted without ceremony and crossed to Tahnee first, crouching beside her, murmuring low in Apache, one hand passing once over her hair, the way an uncle confirms with his own eyes what his ears have already been told. She managed a few words back, steady despite the shaking that still ran through her, an accounting of the mules lost, the water rising too fast to outrun, the stranger's hand closing over her wrist when she had already stopped believing any hand would find her in time. It tightened the old man's jaw and lifted his gaze slowly to Emmett and held it there. "You pulled her from the water, plain and unhurried, each word set down like a stone in a wall." "Yes, sir." Emmett didn't move. Didn't have time to think on it much beyond that. No, a man rarely does. In that moment it is after that the thinking begins. He rose slow with a particular care of knees that remembered every winter they had survived, and studied Emmett the way a rancher studies a horse he has not yet decided to buy. "Do you know what it means among my mother's people when a life is pulled back out of water that had already decided to keep it?" Emmett only shook his head. 28 years in this territory. Enough Apache traded fair across the agency counter, but never once had he needed to know this. The debt does not belong to her. It belongs to the water. And the water does not forgive a debt for nothing. Bidzil let that settle before he went on. When one of our own is taken back, from the flood, from the fever, from the fall off a high place, when death has already laid its hand on a person and a stranger's hand pulls them free of it, our law does not call that chance. It calls it a binding. The one pulled from death belongs for a season and a year to the one who pulled them free, not as property, as a debt owed in the body until it is repaid in full. This is the same law that bound my own grandmother to the man who pulled her from a canyon fall 3 winters before I was born, and made of that binding a marriage that outlasted every soldier who ever doubted it would hold. Tahnee's head came up sharp at that, water still dripping off the ends of her hair into the mud, and whatever protest was climbing her throat, her uncle silenced it with nothing more than a glance. "Uncle?" She had never in her life been a woman who accepted silence over something true. "I am not a debt to be handed to a stranger. You are alive." When the river had already decided otherwise. Not unkindly, but final. That is not a small thing to argue against, and you know our ways well enough to know I do not invent this law to please myself. It is older than the agency, older than the treaty lines, older than any of us standing on this bank. Back to Emmett now. She will come to your land, rancher. She will work beside you, learn something of your ways as you learn something of hers, until the debt between you and the water is settled and the elders agree it is paid. This is not a sentence laid on either of you. It is how our people have always kept the account of a life saved, so it is never forgotten the moment the danger passes. Emmett had spent enough seasons on this range reading men whose word could be trusted to know he was looking at one now, and he understood, dripping there on the bank, that he was being handed a serious thing dressed up as a simple one. "Didn't pull her out," looking to be owed anything. Careful, weighing each word before he spent it. Wouldn't feel right, taking a woman onto my land like a debt come due. Then you will treat her as a guest who has not yet chosen to stay, and she will treat your roof as a shelter she has not yet chosen to leave. The law asks only that the season be honored. What either of you makes of the season is your own business and none of mine to decide. His gaze went once more to his niece, something passing between them that Emmett could not read, though he understood it all the same. To be love wearing the shape of a hard decision. Go with him, Tahnee. I will send word to your mother, and I will come myself before the first snow, to see how the debt stands. No ceremony beyond that. No drums, no blessing spoken over them. Nothing a man expecting spectacle might have wanted to witness. Only an old man mounting his horse, a line of riders turning back up the ridge, Nayland twisting once in her saddle for a last look at her cousin before the trail bent and hid her, and a soaked, furious, frightened young woman left standing on a muddy bank beside a stranger she had known less than an hour. Both of them dripping river water onto ground that cared nothing at all for what law had just been laid across their lives. I can walk, iron enough in it that Emmett, reaching to help her stand, let his hand drop and believed her. She walked the whole 4 miles back to his spread-on legs, still trembling with cold, and did not once ask him to slow his horse to match her pace, and Emmett, watching her from the saddle, found himself slowing it anyway, without being asked to, because some things a decent man simply does without needing to be told twice. Twice more along that road she stumbled on the uneven ground, and twice more she waved off the hand he offered before it had even fully reached toward her, until the third time when her knee buckled hard on a loose stone, and pride alone was not enough to keep her upright. She let him steady her elbow for the length of 10 strides before pulling free again. Chin lifted, daring him to remark on it. He didn't. That, too, she filed away. His ranch sat low against a hillside, a modest frame house he'd built with his own 2 hands and a borrowed team 6 years back, a barn kept better than the house, and a silence over the whole place that Tahnee noticed before she noticed anything else about it. No woman's touch on the curtains, no second set of boots by the door. One chair pulled close to the stove, worn soft in a single spot and nowhere else. A shelf of tinned goods, stacked with a bachelor's indifference to order. A rifle clean to a shine that told her plainly which of his possessions actually mattered to him. She had grown up reading what a dwelling revealed about the person living inside it, and this one told her, plainly, that Emmett Cole lived here, alone, had for some time, and had made his peace with it the way a man makes peace with a wound that has stopped bleeding but never quite closed. "There's a room." He showed her past the kitchen to a small space that had, by the dust on its one shelf, sat unused for years. Was going to be for... He stopped, cleared his throat, tried again. "It's yours, long as the law says it needs to be." Was going to be for whom? Not really a question. She had already read the answer in the catch of his voice. He looked at the floor a long moment. "My wife, Ruth. Fever took her the second winter we were married, before we ever got around to needing a second room. Plain without asking for pity, the way a man reports a fact of weather. 4 years this coming January." A small nod was all Tahnee gave back, though something in her posture eased a degree, the way a wary animal eases when it recognizes another creature carrying its own scars. She did not thank him for the room. She did not yet trust herself to be grateful for anything about an arrangement that bound her to a stranger's house by a law she'd never asked to be measured against. But she filed the fact of Ruth away carefully, the way she filed away everything that might later prove useful in understanding a man who held her fate, for a season, in his open, careful hands. That first night she lay a long while on a bed still faintly scented with the cedar shavings it had been built from, listening to a house make sounds she didn't yet know the meaning of, a settling board here, a shutter working loose there, and found herself, despite every reason pride gave her not to, straining instead to hear the sound of him moving in the loft above. Boots dropped one at a time, a low cough, and then nothing. It was, she would admit to no one, the first night since the flood that she had not dreamed of brown water closing over her head. The first days were a truce. Neither of them had signed, but both of them kept. Tahnee rose before Emmett, out of old habit more than any wish to please him, and had the stove going and coffee boiled by the time he came down from the loft, where he'd insisted on sleeping so she could keep the one proper room. He in turn made himself scarce, most daylight hours, giving her the run of the house as though his own presence in it might otherwise feel like a cage. Neither spoke much those first days. There was a great deal neither of them yet knew how to say, and a greater deal still that neither trusted the other to hear kindly. Their first meal together set the pattern for every one that followed. Emmett set a plate of beans and hard bread in front of her that first evening, the whole of his cooking repertoire laid bare in one apologetic offering, and ate his own portion standing at the counter rather than sit across from a stranger the law had put in his house. Tahnee ate in silence, said nothing about the food, and the next morning rose before him and made a thin stew of dried venison and the wild onions she'd found growing along his fence line, setting 2 plates at the table itself rather than one at the counter and one standing. Emmett looked at the second plate a long moment before he sat down to it. Neither of them remarked on the change. It became, without either one deciding it should, simply how meals were taken in that house from then on, together, at the table, in a quiet that grew less guarded by careful degrees. It was work that finally cracked the silence further, the way work generally does between 2 people too proud to talk their way past a wall. She found him one afternoon, fighting a fence post rotted through at the base, cursing it in language a church-going man wouldn't have used in company, and instead of walking past as she'd meant to, she set down the water she carried and took up the second end of the post without being asked. You don't have to. Surprised enough to nearly drop his end. I know what I have to do and what I choose to do. She set the post where it belonged with an economy of motion that told him plainly this was not her first fence. Your people build these to hold animals in. Mine build brush shelters that move with the herd. I have wondered since I came here which is the wiser way. Depends on the animal, I expect. Dry enough that it surprised a short laugh out of her, quick and startled, as though she hadn't expected to find anything about this arrangement funny. That laugh did more work between them than a week of careful silence had managed. By the second week she was mending his shirts unasked and correcting the crude Apache phrases he'd picked up at the trading post, laughing outright at his mangling of the words for water and horse and stubborn no. One evening she set 2 stones and a tin cup on the table between them and made a game of it, naming each object slow and clear, waiting while he repeated it back, correcting the flattened vowel that turned water into something closer to a curse word until he had it near enough that she allowed it to pass. In exchange, he taught her the English names for the tools hung along his barn wall, drawing the shape of each one in the dirt with a stick when the word alone didn't carry, and found himself, more than once, laughing outright himself at how thoroughly she despised the word pliers, which she declared sounded like a sneeze and refused, for a full week. To say correctly out of pure stubbornness, by the 3rd week, he'd learned enough to greet her properly each morning, rough as it came out, and she had stopped flinching, faintly, whenever he came within arm's reach of her. She was, Emmett noticed in ways he did not entirely trust himself to admit, a strikingly handsome woman, even soaked through and shaking on a river bank, dry and steady, and moving through his kitchen in morning light. She was closer to arresting, dark eyes that missed nothing, a wide, sure mouth that curved rare but true when something actually amused her, black hair worn in a single heavy braid, and a figure that filled out her dewskin dress in ways he made a considerable disciplined effort not to dwell on, and largely failed. He kept those thoughts to himself with the same discipline he'd apply to a green colt. Firm hand, no sudden moves, a great deal of patience with his own foolishness. Tahnee, for her part, was not blind to the way his gaze sometimes lingered, a half-second past politeness, before he caught himself and looked away, jaw tight, ears reddening under the sun-brown of his skin. She found, to her own private irritation, that she did not entirely mind it. Nothing in the way Emmett Cole looked at her matched the flat, appraising stares she'd endured from agency clerks and soldiers who saw an Apache woman and priced her like livestock at auction. His looking felt more like a man losing an argument with himself and knowing it. The first real crack in the wall between their two worlds came not from tenderness, but from a small, sharp humiliation Emmett never intended. A neighbor's boy rode out that second week to trade for eggs, and, catching sight of Tahnee at the well, called out to Cole's Apache girl, loud enough to carry the way a boy repeats a phrase he's heard grown men use without understanding its weight. Tahnee's spine went straight as a rifle barrel. Not a word to the boy, not a flicker of anything on her face, beyond a coldness that sent him back to his horse faster than his errand required. But nothing to Emmett either. Not that whole afternoon, until that evening, when she finally set down her mending and looked at him steady across the low fire. "I have a name, Tahnee. Not Cole's girl, not the Apache woman at his ranch." Each sentence set down flat and separate, like stones she'd been carrying all day and was finally glad to put down. "I would ask that you correct it the next time you hear it spoken that way in front of you." Emmett's ears went red, this time from shame rather than admiration. Should have corrected it myself and didn't think fast enough. Won't happen twice. And it didn't. The next man who rode out and made the same careless mistake within Emmett's hearing found himself corrected so plainly and so immediately, in front of two other ranch hands who repeated the story at the saloon that same week for the sheer entertainment of it, that word of it reached the agency post inside a week. And no one made that particular mistake near Emmett Cole's ranch again. You didn't have to do that. She found him afterward mending harness by lamplight, still turning the exchange over. Most men wouldn't trouble themselves over a name. Most men aren't sharing their table with the woman whose name it is. He didn't look up from the leather in his hands. Figured that ought to count for something. It was a small thing in the accounting of a whole life. Tahnee noticed, all the same, how quickly he had moved to mend it and filed that away too, beside the fact of Ruth, beside the empty room, beside every other small true thing she was quietly gathering about the man the law had bound her to. Autumn deepened into the kind of clear, cold light Arizona saves for its finest days, and the ranch settled into a rhythm neither of them had planned, and both of them had, without quite admitting it, come to depend on. Evenings found them at his table more often than not, sharing meals that had started as two separate habits, his plain-range cooking, her mother's recipes reworked with whatever his kitchen offered, and slowly becoming one dish that was neither wholly his nor wholly hers, but some new thing built out of both. Some evenings it was little more than mescal roasted slow in a pit she'd dug behind the barn the way her aunts had taught her, sweet and smoky and utterly foreign to a man raised on salt pork and biscuit, and Emmett ate a second helping of it the first night without being asked, which pleased her more than she let herself admit. He taught her the brand marks on his cattle and the ledger lines in his account book, patient with her questions in a way she suspected he was not naturally patient with much of anything. She taught him the names of the plants along the wash that could heal a wound, season a stew, or in the wrong hands do considerably worse, and taught him 36 words of a language that had, before she came to his house, been nothing to him but sounds traded across a counter. There were quieter lessons, too. Ones neither of them called lessons at the time. She showed him one cold morning how her mother wove a burden basket tight enough to carry water, without losing a drop across 2 miles of rough trail, her fingers moving through the willow shoots with a patience Emmett found himself simply watching, rather than helping, content for once to be the one learning instead of teaching. He showed her in turn how to read weather in the particular color A sky turned before a hard freeze, a skill his own father had drilled into him as a boy, and which he'd never had cause to pass to anyone since. Small trades, small deposits, each one into an account. Neither of them was yet willing to call by its true name. He split his palm open badly on a cracked axe handle, midway through that stretch of clear weather, deep enough that it bled through 2 rags, before he'd even made it back to the house, and Tahnee took his hand without asking permission. The same unhesitating competence she'd shown at the fence post now turned to something more exacting. She packed the cut with crushed leaves from a low gray-green shrub growing wild along the wash, wrapped it tight with a strip torn from her own petticoat when his rag supply ran short, and made him hold his arm above his heart for the better part of an hour while she told him to keep his mind off the throb of it. The story of how her grandmother had once set a warrior's shattered leg using nothing but 2 lengths of straight willow and a song sung low the whole while to keep his spirit from wandering off in the pain. Emmett asked, half serious, whether the song was doing anything for his hand. She told him the song was for the healer's nerves, not the patient's wound, and that hers at the moment needed it considerably. He laughed despite the pain, and something in the sound of it settled a worry in her chest. She hadn't fully known she was carrying since the axe first came down wrong. Tell me about her. One evening the fire burned low. The silence between them turned companionable rather than guarded. Ruth, you keep her memory the way a man keeps a fence, mended but never torn down to look at closely. Emmett turned his coffee cup slow in his hands a long moment. She wasn't like you, quieter. Never argued with me about much of anything, which I used to think I wanted, till I understood it mostly meant she didn't feel safe enough to. He looked up, met her eyes. You argue with me plenty. Strange thing to say, but I believe I've come to prefer it. I argue because you are worth arguing with. There is a difference between a man who deserves a woman's silence and one who has earned her honesty. She held his gaze steady across the low fire. You have not once in 5 weeks spoken to me the way the men at the agency post speak to my people. Not once looked at me like I am a debt they intend to collect rather than a woman they intend to know. I did not expect that. Coming here, I have not forgiven myself yet for how much I have come to expect it now. Something in that admission seemed to cost her more than she'd meant to spend, and she looked away into the fire a long moment before she went on, quieter now. My mother warned me, before I ever came here, that a white man's kindness in the daylight often turns into something considerably less kind once a door is closed. I have watched for it in you every week since. I have not found it yet. She glanced at him sidelong. I begin to think I will not. Wouldn't know how to be that man, even if I tried to learn it. He turned his cup once more in his hands, working up to something. Truth is, since Ruth, I'd about decided this house was only ever going to hold one kind of quiet, the kind that doesn't argue back because there's nobody left in it to argue. You coming into it, law or no law, has been the first thing in 4 years that's made this place feel like it's got a future worth getting up for. Didn't expect that. Don't rightly know what to do with it yet. It was as close as either of them had come to saying the thing plainly, and Emmett very nearly reached across that fire and took her hand right then, and might have, if the fever hadn't found him first, 3 days later, before either of them worked up the courage to close that last small distance. It was the 4th week when the ague dropped him, a bad case he'd likely carried in his blood since a full summer spent building fence and standing water, and it kept him from rising for the better part of 3 days. She found him soaked through and shaking, muttering names she didn't know in his sleep, and she did not hesitate. She had grown up watching her mother and her aunt's doctor sickness with more skill than any agency physician Emmett had ever been dragged to see, and she put that knowledge to work without asking his leave. Boiling willow bark for the fever, a poultice of mountain herbs gathered herself from the hillside behind his barn, sitting up with him through 2 full nights. Cool cloths against his burning skin, low Apache words when the English ones wouldn't reach him anymore. "You are not allowed to die in this bed." The worst of it, the second night, his fever climbed high enough to frighten even her steady hands. "The debt is not yet settled, and I refuse to owe a ghost." Half in jest, testing whether some part of him could still hear well enough to be provoked into fighting it, and something in him did seem to hear it, because his breathing steadied not long after, and by the gray hour before dawn, the fever broke at last, leaving him hollowed out, but unmistakably, gratefully alive. He woke fully near midday to find her asleep in the chair beside his bed. Chin dropped to her chest, exhaustion written plain across a face that had not once in 3 days let him see how frightened she'd actually been. He lay still, a long while just watching her, and when she woke and found him watching, neither of them pretended it was nothing. "You saved my life. Twice paid now. Once at the river, once in this bed." Voice still rough with the fever's aftermath. "The law does not keep 2 ledgers. No sharpness left in it, none of what might have carried a month before. There is one debt. I have only helped you live long enough to keep paying it. Funny way you have of not caring about a man." She stood, straightening her dress, refusing to let him see how close that observation had landed to a truth she wasn't yet ready to speak aloud. "Drink the tea. I left you, and stop trying to argue theology with a woman who has been awake for 2 days. But something had shifted between them in that sick room, plain as the turning season outside its window, and both of them knew it, and both of them, for the time being, let the knowing sit quiet and unspoken, the way you let a wound close before you test its strength. She grew stronger in the weeks that followed, not just in nursing him back, but in the ranch itself, riding out with him at dawn to check the herd, her seat on a horse so naturally sure that Emmett stopped offering to saddle a gentler mount for her after the second week, learning the boundaries of his lease as well as he knew them himself, until neighbors riding past no longer saw a stranger at Cole's side, but a partner who plainly belonged there, law or no law. She began, too, teaching him more of her own people's ways than plants and words, the meaning behind the 4 sacred directions, the respect owed to us and the Creator, and the mountain spirits the old ones called the God. The reason her people never spoke a dead relative's name aloud for fear of calling their spirit back before it was ready to rest. The careful etiquette of never pointing directly at a person with a single finger, using instead a tilt of the chin or a soft gesture of the whole hand, a courtesy so worn into her that she caught herself teaching it to him before she'd fully decided to. She told him, too, of her own coming-of-age ceremony 4 years past, the sunrise dance her mother and aunts had spent a full year saving to hold for her. 4 days of dancing meant to carry a girl into white-painted woman's own strength, and how she still felt some thin thread of that blessing in her whenever her own strength ran low. Emmett listened the way he listened to nothing else in his life, careful and unhurried, storing each piece the way he'd store a good tool. "You listen better than most preachers I've sat under." Not entirely joking. Figure a man ought to understand the woman sharing his roof, law or no law. He left it there, because there was more underneath that sentence than either of them was quite ready to lift into the light. 3 riders came into the yard one evening at a pace that told Emmett before they'd even dismounted that trouble had arrived ahead of any greeting. He knew the lead rider by sight, and by poor reputation both, Silas Boone, who ran a small outfit 2 valleys over, and had spent the better part of a decade being the kind of neighbor decent ranchers kept a wary distance from, a man who made no secret, at the agency and in the saloon, of his opinion that Apache land ought to belong to whoever was willing enough to take it. Cole Boone didn't bother dismounting, eyes sliding past Emmett to fix on Tahnee in the doorway. "Word's got round you've taken in one of the agency's strays. Man ought to be careful what he lets live under his roof. Some folks in town are asking why a white rancher's keeping an Apache woman out here alone, and I don't imagine the answers they're guessing at are doing your name any favors. My business isn't yours to guess at, Boone. Level a warning plane underneath it. Might not be, but it becomes the county's business when there's talk of Indian agents coming around asking why a ward of the reservation's living off it without a permit filed. I'd hate to see a man lose good grazing land over a woman. He's got no legal claim to keep. He let that sit smiling thin. Unless, of course, you'd care to sell that north pasture I've had my eye on. Man, in a difficult spot with the agency, might find a fair price, mighty convenient right about now. Emmett understood the shape of the threat plainly enough. Manufactured trouble dressed up as concern, aimed at squeezing a land sale out of him through the one lever Boone had found to pull. Get off my land, quiet, level. Before I stopped being polite about asking twice, Boone laughed unhurried and turned his horse. You've got until the agent's next circuit. 3 weeks, maybe 4. Plenty of time to reconsider that pasture, Cole, or to explain to a federal man why an unmarried Apache woman's been sharing your roof all this while. He rode out with his 2 men trailing him, and the yard went quiet, in a way considerably colder than the autumn evening accounted for. He means to use me against you. No fear in her voice, only a flat, clear-eyed reading of the danger. The same steadiness she'd shown, pulling herself half-drowned from the river weeks before. He means to try. Doesn't mean he'll manage it. He does not need to manage the land. He only needs to manage the story. An agent hearing the wrong version of why I am here could send me back to the agency in irons for a permit I never had reason to carry, and could see you fined or worse for harboring me. Boone does not need the truth, Emmett. He only needs enough doubt to make trouble profitable for himself. Something hardened in Emmett's jaw that had nothing to do with anger at her and everything to do with a sudden, sharp understanding of exactly how much he stood to lose and in what order he'd choose to lose it. Then we make sure there's no doubt to find. The 3 weeks that followed were spent less in fear than in careful, deliberate work, and it was Tahnee, more than once, who did the deciding. She rode to the rancheria herself, alone, to speak with her uncle, and found the visit harder than she'd braced for. Not because Bidzil doubted her, but because 2 of the older women of the band, aunts who had known her since infancy, cornered her by the cook fires and asked plainly whether she understood what it would cost her standing among her own people to marry outside the band entirely, whether she had considered that her children would belong fully to neither world and be trusted at times by both. Tahnee had no easy answer for them, only the truth as she currently understood it, that she did not yet know what she meant to choose, only that she had stopped dreading the choice the way she had at the riverbank. Nallen, listening from the edge of that conversation, was the only one who took her hand afterward and told her, quietly, that she had never seen her cousin look less like a woman being punished by a law, and more like one working her own way toward something she wanted. She came back 2 days later with Bidzil's word that he would stand before any federal agent and testify plainly to a law recognized, however grudgingly, under the treaty's own acknowledgment of tribal custom, a right the government's own agents were bound to honor when a headman spoke it clear. She spent an evening teaching Emmett exactly which words to use and which to avoid when the agent came, understanding better than he did which arguments would land on a federal ear and which would only sound like an excuse dressed in Sunday clothes. You are better at fighting this than I am. One night close to the agent's circuit, watching her set out testimony with the same steady competence she'd shown pulling fence posts and doctoring fevers, Ruth would have left this entirely to me, trusted me to handle it, and stayed clear. Then Ruth trusted you with more faith than sense, not unkindly. A man saved my life once in a river. I do not intend to spend the whole of this debt only being saved. Some of it I mean to spend, saving him back. Something unguarded crossed her face for the first time since the riverbank. You did not choose to be a rescuer. Neither did I choose to be rescued, but I find I do not mind standing beside you in this, rather than only owing you for it. Boone did not wait meekly for his own deadline. 2 nights before the agent circuit he came back, not riding openly up the drive this time, but under cover of dark, with 2 men and a plan to burn Emmett's north barn and blame agency trouble that would make his case against Tahnee's presence for him without a single word needing to be spoken in daylight. She woke first, some old instinct honed by a lifetime of reading danger in the sounds a night was not supposed to make, and roused Emmett with a hard hand on his shoulder and a whispered warning before the first torch had even been struck. What followed happened fast and ugly in the dark, a scuffle at the barn door, a torch knocked loose and stamped out before it caught, Emmett taking a hard blow to the ribs from a man twice his weight before Tahnee came up behind that same man with a length of harness leather set a strike her uncle's warriors would have claimed with pride. Boone himself, caught between his fleeing men and the sudden, unwelcome sight of an Apache woman standing over one of his hired hands without a flicker of fear in her, chose the coward's math and ran for his horse rather than his cause. The whole ugly business was over inside 5 minutes, leaving Emmett bruised and winded on the ground and Tahnee kneeling over him, checking his ribs with the same steady hands that had once pressed cool cloths to his fevered skin weeks before. "You came for me." Half a laugh caught up in the pain of it. "Didn't need saving twice in one lifetime, and here you are again." "I did not save you?" Her hands lingered on his chest a moment longer than the examination strictly required. "I only refused to let a debt of mine be burned down for another man's greed." But her eyes, meeting his in the dark, said something considerably less guarded than her words, and Emmett, ribs aching, reached up anyway and laid his hand over hers where it rested against his chest. "Call it whatever law you like. I know what I saw. You didn't come out here because a debt made you. You came because you wanted me living." She had no answer for that in words, and needed none. The federal agent, when he came through on his circuit 2 days later, found a rancher with bruised ribs, a headman's sworn testimony to a recognized custom, and no doubt whatsoever left for Boone's whispered story to take root in. He rode on with the matter closed, and the land and the woman both plainly accounted for. Winter came on hard and clean after that, the kind of season that strips a country down to what's true in it, and it stripped Emmett and Tahnee down to a truth neither of them any longer pretended not to see. The law had bound them for a season and a year. The season was not yet spent, but something else had grown up inside its borders that owed nothing to any debt at all. There was a particular evening, deep in that first hard winter, that Tahnee would remember longer than almost any other. A blue norther had blown through overnight, dropping the temperature so far that even the well froze solid by morning, and Emmett had spent the whole day breaking ice and hauling water while she kept the stove roaring and the house sealed tight against the wind, finding its way through every crack in the frame. By evening they sat close by, necessity rather than choice, sharing the one good blanket in the house because the loft had gone too cold for sleeping, and pride had finally lost its argument with common sense. Neither of them spoke of what it meant. Two people sharing warmth in the dark with a full season's worth of careful distance finally collapsed to nothing. Neither of them needed to. His hand found hers under the blanket sometime past midnight, and she did not pull away. And that was the whole of it, and it was enough. Bidzil came as he had promised before the first real snow, riding into the yard with 2 of his sons, and a face that gave away nothing of what he'd come to judge. He found his niece splitting, kindling with an ease that told him plainly she had not spent the season as a prisoner, and he found Emmett mending a saddle by the barn with 3 Apache words stitched unmistakably into his ordinary rancher's speech. He watched the 2 of them a long while before he said anything at all. The debt. Finally, to Tahnee, "How does it stand?" She set down her axe and considered the question with the same care she gave everything that mattered. "The water gave me back my life. This man asked nothing for it beyond a season's honest work and an honest roof, which I have given, and gladly. If you ask whether the debt is paid, uncle, I tell you plainly, it was paid the week the fever nearly took him, and I sat up 2 nights refusing to let it. Anything since has not been payment. It has been choice." His gaze moved to Emmett. "And you, rancher, Do you release her from the law's binding now the debt stands settled? No hesitation in Emmett at all when he answered, Never wanted to hold her by a law. I'll release her from it gladly, if that's what she wants. A pause. But I'd be lying to you and to myself both if I said I wanted her walking off this land once the law let her go. I'm asking her to stay, for a reason that's got nothing to do with any debt, sir. I've come to love her, plain as that, and I don't know how to make my life make sense any more without her in the middle of it. Bidzil's face, weathered by 40 years of careful stillness, did something neither of them had seen it do before, softened just at the edges into something that might, on a less guarded man, have been called a smile. That is not a question the old law was ever built to answer. That is a question only she can answer, and I did not ride out here to answer it for her. All eyes turned to Tahnee, and she did not make them wait long, because she had known the answer in truth since the night she knelt over a bruised, breathless rancher in the dark and understood that what she felt reaching for his hand had never once been obligation. The river tried to take my life, and this man refused to let it. I spent a season believing I owed him a debt for that. I understand now that I was wrong. What I owe him is nothing. What I choose to give him, my hand, my house, whatever years this land allows us. Both, that is not a debt at all. That is love, Uncle, plainly said, and I will not pretend otherwise to satisfy an old law that has already done its work. She crossed the yard to where Emmett stood and took his hand in front of her uncle and his sons and the whole wide watching winter sky, and he looked at her like a man who had spent 4 cold years believing his house would never again hold anything worth keeping and had just been proven gloriously wrong. They were married before the snow melted, in a ceremony honoring both the customs Tahnee had grown up inside and the plain, unadorned faith Emmett had been raised in, Bidzil himself standing witness beside a circuit preacher who rode 2 extra days out of his way to perform it. The whole rancheria coming down from the hills for a feast that lasted long into a clear winter night, laughter and firelight and 2 languages tangled together over the same shared meal. Tahnee wore, for the ceremony, a dress her mother and aunts had worked on through the whole last month of the debt season without her knowledge, fringed buckskin and fine beadwork sewn by hands that had decided, long before Tahnee said the word aloud herself, exactly how this story was going to end. Bidzil himself blessed the union in the old way before the preacher ever spoke his own words over them, scattering a small handful of pollen to the 4 directions and asking Ussen's favor on adjoining. He admitted plainly to the gathered crowd that no ceremony of his people had ever quite anticipated a rancher and a headman's niece, bound first by a water debt neither had chosen and finished, in the end, by a choice both of them had made with open eyes. Nallen stood close by Tahnee's side through the whole of it, radiant with an eagerness that told Emmett, watching her, exactly how much this match had come to mean to the whole family, and not merely to the 2 people standing at its center. Boone sold his outfit within the year and moved on to trouble some other stretch of territory, his schemes having earned him nothing but the settled contempt of every rancher and every agency official who'd watched the matter play out from start to finish. The north pasture stayed exactly where it belonged, and Emmett's herd grew steadily across it, tended now by 2 sets of capable hands instead of one lonely man's. The old law of the water debt is still spoken of, here and there, among the families who remember it, but those who tell the story of Tahnee and Emmett Cole rarely dwell long on the law itself. They dwell instead on the woman who was pulled from a flood, and chose in the end to give far more than any debt had ever required of her, and on the man who learned that the truest rescue is rarely the one performed in a single desperate moment in rushing water. It is the slower, harder one, chosen again, for as long as 2 lives agree to share one roof. The river took nothing from Tahnee that autumn that was not returned to her tenfold by the life she built on its far bank, and Emmett Cole, who had once measured his days only by what winter had taken from him, learned at last to measure them instead by everything one drowning woman, and the sacred law that bound her to him. In the years that followed, travelers passing through that stretch of Arizona sometimes asked after the ranch where an Apache woman and a rancher had built a life together against every expectation the territory held for such a pairing, and those who knew the family well enough to answer honestly always said the same. Sacred or otherwise is a poor word for what grows between two people who choose each other freely once the reckoning is done. Tahnee kept her uncle's counsel close all her days, and taught her own children, in time, both her mother's tongue and her husband's, so the ranch rang. Summer evenings with two languages spoken easy and unafraid in the same breath, exactly as she had once dreamed it might, back when she was only a frightened woman coughing up river water on a muddy bank, not yet knowing that the very law meant to bind her would be the thing in the end that finally set her free to choose. Bidzil rode out to that ranch every autumn after, without fail, for as long as his knees allowed him the journey, and each visit he asked the same question out of old habit more than any real need to hear the answer. How does the debt stand? And each year, Tahnee gave him some version of the same reply. That there had never truly been a debt at all once you looked at it plainly. Only two people the river had seen fit to introduce, and a law, wise enough to give them the season they needed to notice what had been standing in front of them the whole time. He would nod, satisfied, and accept whatever meal Emmett's table offered that year, and watch his niece's children chase each other across a yard that had once held nothing but a lonely man's silence, and think, privately, that of all the judgments he had ever been called upon to render in 40 hard years of holding his people's law, this was the one he had never once regretted. Nellen married into a neighboring band herself a few years on, and swore ever after that it was watching her cousin choose a stranger's ranch over easy comfort, and make of that choice a whole rich life that had taught her not to be afraid of a future that didn't look exactly like the one she'd been raised to expect. She named her own first daughter partly for Tahnee, and told the girl, growing up, the story of a flood and a rancher and a law that had asked two proud people to share a season, and how they had answered that ask with considerably more than the law itself had ever demanded of them. It became in time one of those stories a family tells at its own fires long after the people in it are gone, not because the law was remarkable, though it was old and it was real, but because two ordinary stubborn hearts had taken what could have stayed a cold arrangement and warmed it, day by unremarkable day, into something neither the river, nor the reservation, nor the whole hard territory around them had ever quite managed to drown.